Dawn, September 15th, 1959. River Rouge Plant, Detroit. Soviet engineer Mikhail Petrov steps out of a Ford sedan onto concrete still warm from yesterday's shift. He expects a polite factory tour, clean demo areas, carefully staged production lines, maybe some impressive numbers to scribble in his notebook. Instead, he hears something that shouldn't exist, the thunderous rhythm of machinery that apparently never stopped. His American guide casually mentions they're starting second shift. Petrov's translator struggles there's no Russian phrase for third shift. The concept doesn't exist in Soviet factories. Then Petrov sees workers streaming out as others stream in. Not a shift change, a shift exchange. The assembly line never stops. Not for breaks, not for sleep, not for anything. In the past 24 hours, this single American plant produced 1,247 automobiles. Petrov's entire Moscow facility produces 100 cars per month. His guide hands him yesterday's production slip like a grocery receipt. Not bad for a Tuesday, he says. If one Detroit factory can outproduce an entire Soviet region while Americans sleep, what else did Moscow get completely wrong? Hit subscribe for more buried Cold War stories that reveal what really happened behind the headlines. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these untold accounts reach across the world. Dawn breaks over Detroit like a red warning light, casting long shadows across the concrete plaza outside Ford's River Rouge plant. The air smells of steel dust and motor oil, mixed with the sweet scent of autumn leaves drifting down from the few trees that manage to grow between the industrial buildings. Mikhail Petrov pulls his gray wool coat tighter as he steps out of the black Ford sedan, his leather briefcase clutched in his left hand, a small notebook already tucked under his arm. At 34, he has seen plenty of factories, the grinding, heroic struggle of Soviet industrial might, where workers sang patriotic songs to keep rhythm with the machines. But this morning feels different. The sound hits him first before his eyes can make sense of what he's seeing. The plant hums with a deep mechanical pulse that seems to rise from the earth itself. Not the stop-and-start rhythm he knows from Moscow's automotive facilities, where machines pause for maintenance, where workers gather for political meetings, where production halts for the careful inspection of party officials. This sound never wavers. It flows like a river, constant and relentless, as if the building itself has a heartbeat that never sleeps. Petrov checks his Soviet-made watch, 7:15 in the morning, and wonders if American machines simply don't need rest the way Soviet equipment does. His translator, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses named Victor, stands beside him looking equally puzzled. They had been told to expect an impressive display of American industrial capacity, but nothing in their briefings prepared them for this. Jim Morrison emerges from the plant's main entrance, a stocky man in his 40s wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and a thin black tie that has seen better days. His handshake is firm but not aggressive, his smile genuine but not overeager. There's something refreshing about his manner. No political speeches, no elaborate ceremonies, just a working supervisor ready to show visitors around his facility. Morrison speaks in a flat Midwestern accent that Victor translates with careful precision, though some concepts seem to give the interpreter pause. Morrison mentions they're starting second shift, and Victor's face wrinkles in concentration. He whispers to Petrov in Russian, explaining that there's no direct translation for what Americans call third shift. In Soviet factories, there is day shift and sometimes night shift during wartime production pushes, but this idea of a continuous cycle spanning all 24 hours simply doesn't exist in their vocabulary. As they walk toward the main entrance, Petrov notices something that makes him stop in his tracks. Workers are streaming out of the plant while others stream in. But this isn't the familiar scene of a workday ending and beginning. These men carry lunch pails and wear the same company badges, the same blue work shirts, the same steel-toed boots. They nod to each other in passing, exchange quick words about family and weather, but there's no celebration of a day's work completed, no exhausted relief of clocking out. Instead, this looks like a relay race where runners pass an invisible baton, keeping the race going without ever stopping. The men leaving look as alert as the men arriving. The machines inside never pause to acknowledge the change. Morrison guides them through the entrance, past security guards who barely glance up from their newspapers, into a world that defies everything Petrov thought he knew about industrial production. The assembly line stretches farther than he can see, disappearing into the distance like a steel horizon. Cars in various stages of completion move along tracks with mechanical precision, each vehicle advancing exactly 18 inches every minute. Workers stand at precise intervals, each performing specific tasks with movements so practiced they seem almost choreographed. But what strikes Petrov most forcefully is the absence of the frantic energy he associates with high production. In Moscow, meeting quotas requires heroic effort. Workers pushing themselves beyond normal limits, supervisors shouting encouragement and exhortations. Here, the extraordinary output seems almost casual, as if producing more than 1,000 automobiles daily is merely Tuesday's routine. Morrison hands Petrov a clipboard with yesterday's production numbers, and the Soviet engineer has to read the figures twice to believe them. 1,247 automobiles completed in the past 24 hours. His entire Moscow facility, with its 600 workers and earnest 5-year plans, produces 1,100 vehicles per month. This single American plant, on what Morrison casually dismisses as not bad for a Tuesday, has manufactured more cars than Petrov's operation completes in 4 weeks. The mathematics seem impossible, but the evidence surrounds him on every side. Finished automobiles, gleaming under fluorescent lights, roll off the end of the assembly line at a rate of 1 every 45 seconds. Each car complete, tested, ready for delivery to dealers across America. Morrison explains the shift system with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss the weather. First shift starts at 6 in the morning, second shift begins at 2 in the afternoon, third shift takes over at 10 at night. The plant operates continuously, 7 days a week, pausing only for scheduled maintenance that happens in carefully orchestrated segments while the rest of the line continues moving. Petrov asks about worker fatigue, about the strain of such relentless production, and Morrison's answer surprises him. The workers aren't pushed beyond their limits because the system is designed to sustain itself indefinitely. Each shift operates at a pace that can be maintained hour after hour, day after day, year after year. The secret isn't working harder, it's working smarter. As the morning tour progresses, Petrov fills his notebook with sketches and calculations that will take months to fully analyze. But already, standing in the controlled chaos of American mass production, he understands that he's witnessing something that will change everything he thought he knew about industrial capacity. The plant around him doesn't just produce automobiles, it produces them with an efficiency that makes Soviet 5-year plans look like academic exercises. By the time Morrison leads them toward the cafeteria for lunch, Petrov realizes this visit will require a complete recalculation of what he thought America could accomplish and what it might mean for the global balance of industrial power. By 10 o'clock, Petrov and his team have pulled out their notebooks and begun the methodical work of documenting what seems impossible. Their Soviet-issued stopwatches tick steadily as they time each stage of the assembly process, scribbling numbers that don't match anything in their experience. The Ford line completes 1 automobile every 45 seconds, while Petrov's Moscow plant requires 7.5 minutes to finish each vehicle. He sketches the workflow diagrams with mechanical pencil on graph paper, trying to capture the precise choreography of workers, parts, and machinery that creates this relentless productivity. Every few minutes, he stops to double-check his calculations, certain he must be making an error, but the numbers remain stubbornly consistent. The contrast becomes more stark as Morrison leads them deeper into the facility. At Petrov's Moscow plant, production stops for 2 hours each morning, while maintenance crews perform essential repairs on temperamental Soviet machinery. Here, maintenance happens continuously by roving teams of specialists who service equipment while the line keeps moving. When a machine needs attention, workers simply shift their position slightly while technicians perform repairs, then return to their normal stations without missing a beat. The assembly line never stops, never pauses, never acknowledges the human effort required to keep it functioning. It flows like a mechanical river that has learned to repair itself while still moving toward the sea. Morrison introduces them to Bill Kowalski, a stocky man with graying hair and hands stained permanently black from years of handling automotive parts. Kowalski speaks in the straightforward manner of men who work with their hands, answering Petrov's questions through Victor's careful translation with patience and obvious pride in his craft. He makes $2.85 per hour, which Victor calculates equals approximately 800 rubles, the monthly salary of a Soviet automotive engineer. Kowalski works 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, with paid vacations and health benefits that his union negotiated with Ford management. He owns a house in nearby Dearborn, drives 2 cars, one for himself, one for his wife, and sends his oldest daughter to Michigan State University, where she studies to become a teacher. During lunch break, Kowalski opens a metal lunch pail that could have come from any American factory for the past 30 years. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, sits a thick sandwich of ham and cheese on white bread, an apple that still smells of the orchard, and a thermos of coffee that steams when he unscrews the cap. He explains to Petrov that his father carried the same kind of lunch pail when he worked at River Rouge during the 1930s, building the machinery that now builds automobiles. 3 generations of Kowalskis have worked at Ford, each earning enough to live better than their fathers, each contributing to an industrial system that grows more productive with each passing decade. The warehouse tour reveals abundance that Petrov struggles to comprehend. Towers of steel sheets rise toward the ceiling like metallic mountains, while bins of automotive parts stretch in organized rows that disappear into the distance. The parts inventory alone represents more raw materials than some Soviet factories see in an entire year. Morrison explains that Ford contracts with 47 different suppliers within 50 miles of River Rouge, creating a network of specialized companies that exist solely to feed the assembly line's appetite for components. Each supplier focuses on perfecting a single type of part: transmissions, electrical systems, upholstery, glass, rather than trying to manufacture everything internally like Soviet facilities do. The contrast extends to the finished products themselves. Morrison shows them a display area where 14 different Ford models sit, gleaming under fluorescent lights, each designed for specific market segments and customer preferences. There's the compact Falcon for young families, the luxurious Thunderbird for successful professionals, the practical country sedan for large families, and the sporty Galaxy for customers who want power and style. Each model offers multiple color choices, interior options, and accessory packages, creating hundreds of possible combinations that dealers can order to match customer demands. Petrov's Moscow plant produces 2 models, both based on designs from 1954 in black, dark blue, or occasionally gray when paint supplies permit. As afternoon sunlight streams through the factory's high windows, Petrov watches the steady rhythm of American industrial production with growing amazement. The workers move with practiced efficiency, but there's none of the desperate urgency he associates with meeting Soviet quotas. No supervisors shout encouragement, no banners proclaim the importance of exceeding production targets, no loudspeakers broadcast patriotic music to inspire greater effort. The line simply moves, steadily and relentlessly, producing automobiles at a rate that would be celebrated as a heroic achievement in the Soviet Union, but represents nothing more than normal Tuesday operations in Detroit. Morrison walks them past the company parking lot where hundreds of automobiles sit in neat rows under the Michigan sun. These aren't management vehicles or official company cars, they belong to the workers themselves. Assembly line employees, maintenance technicians, supervisors, and secretaries all drive to work in automobiles they can afford on their wages. The parking lot represents more private vehicle ownership than exists in most Soviet cities, yet these cars belong to ordinary American workers who built them with their own hands. The circle of production and consumption creates a kind of economic poetry that Soviet planners never imagined possible. By late afternoon, Petrov's notebook overflows with observations that will take months to analyze fully. The numbers tell an unmistakable story of industrial capacity that dwarfs Soviet achievements, but the human element proves equally remarkable. American workers enjoy material prosperity that would be considered extravagant luxury in the Soviet Union, yet they produce this wealth through their own labor rather than receiving it as gifts from a benevolent state. The system sustains itself through what Morrison calls enlightened self-interest. Companies profit by paying workers enough to buy the products they manufacture, creating a cycle of prosperity that grows stronger with each turn. As September darkness settles over Detroit, Petrov expects the industrial thunder to finally quiet, the way Soviet factories wind down when the evening shift heads home to family dinners and state-sponsored television programs. Instead, something extraordinary happens that shatters his last assumptions about American production. Floodlights blaze to life across the River Rouge complex like artificial suns, casting harsh white light over concrete and steel until the entire facility glows against the Michigan night sky. The plant doesn't sleep, it simply changes guard. Through the main entrance, 2,100 third-shift workers stream past the day shift heading home, a human tide flowing in opposite directions with the practiced efficiency of soldiers changing watch at a fortress that never surrenders. The assembly line rhythm never wavers. Not for a heartbeat, not for a breath, not for the simple human need to rest that governs every other industrial operation Petrov has ever witnessed. The machinery continues its relentless pulse as if powered by some inexhaustible American energy source that Soviet planners never discovered. Morrison introduces them to Tommy Chen, the night shift foreman, a compact man with calloused hands and the quiet confidence of someone who has learned to maintain quality standards when most of the world sleeps. Chen speaks with careful precision, his words translated by Victor into Russian concepts that strain to accommodate the reality of continuous production spanning all 24 hours of the day. Chen walks them through break rooms that feel more like social clubs than the austere facilities Petrov knows from Soviet factories. Coffee machines hum constantly, dispensing hot drinks to workers who pay nothing beyond what their union negotiated with management. Lockers line the walls in neat rows, each assigned to individual workers who decorate them with family photographs and personal mementos. First aid stations stand ready with trained medical personnel because Chen explains that companies discover it costs less to keep workers healthy than to replace injured ones. The concept seems almost revolutionary to Petrov. Capitalism caring for workers not from ideology, but from practical economics that makes human welfare profitable. The scale of night operations defies comprehension. River Rouge consumes enough electricity after sunset to power a city of 100,000 people, drawing energy from power plants that burn coal shipped down from Minnesota and Pennsylvania. The electrical grid that feeds Detroit's industrial appetite represents infrastructure investment that dwarfs most Soviet construction projects. Yet Americans built it without central planning, without 5-year programs, without the political coordination that Soviet leaders consider essential for any major undertaking. Private companies simply recognized profitable opportunities and invested capital to seize them, creating abundance through individual decisions rather than collective wisdom. Chen leads them to a loading dock where freight trains arrive throughout the night, carrying raw materials from across the American continent. 100 railroad cars per day deliver steel from Pittsburgh, aluminum from Tennessee, rubber from Ohio, and glass from factories, scattered across the industrial heartland. Each shipment arrives precisely when needed, coordinated by logistics networks that span thousands of miles without requiring government oversight or bureaucratic approval. The trains come and go like clockwork, feeding the assembly line's appetite for components with mechanical precision that never depends on political decisions or ideological considerations. At the Kowalski family dinner table 5 miles away in Dearborn, Bill finishes his evening meal while his brother Stanley prepares for another night at the same plant where 3 generations of their family have earned steady wages. Stanley works third shift by choice, preferring the slightly higher pay and quieter atmosphere when supervisors go home and workers can focus purely on their craft. The brothers see each other for 30 seconds during shift change, long enough to exchange updates about family and weather before Stanley disappears into the fluorescent-lit world where American industry never rests. Their father worked at River Rouge during World War II, building B-24 bombers that helped win the war, proving that American factories can shift from consumer goods to military production faster than most nations can mobilize their armies. The night shift reveals human dignity that Soviet ideology claims to champion but rarely delivers in practice. Chen shows them how workers organize themselves into informal teams that maintain quality standards without constant supervision. Each employee takes personal responsibility for his section of the assembly line, understanding that his individual performance affects the final product that will carry someone's family safely down American highways. There are no political officers watching for signs of insufficient enthusiasm, no mandatory meetings to discuss production targets, no speeches about patriotic duty. Workers simply do their jobs with professional competence, earning respect through skilled performance rather than ideological conformity. The coffee consumption alone tells a story of abundance that Petrov struggles to reconcile with Soviet scarcity. Third-shift workers drink 2,400 cups of coffee during their 8 hours, more caffeine than some Soviet cities consume in a week. The coffee flows freely from machines that never run empty, supplied by companies that profit by keeping American workers alert and productive. Even this simple beverage represents economic complexity that spans continents. Beans grown in South America, shipped to American ports, processed in roasting plants, distributed through networks that deliver fresh supplies to factory break rooms without requiring government intervention or central planning. From the plant's observation deck, Petrov looks out over Detroit's industrial landscape glowing in the darkness. Dozens of factories operate through the night. General Motors, Chrysler, steel mills, parts manufacturers, and supporting industries that form an ecosystem of production unlike anything that exists in the Soviet Union. The city never sleeps because prosperity never rests, because American workers discovered that abundance comes to those who refuse to accept scarcity as natural or permanent. The lights stretch to the horizon like stars brought down to earth, each representing human ambition unleashed by economic freedom to create wealth that benefits workers and consumers alike. At midnight, Chen walks them past workers who have found their rhythm in the strange democracy of night shift operations, where competence matters more than connections and productivity earns respect regardless of background or beliefs. The assembly line continues its mechanical heartbeat, producing automobiles that will carry American families to jobs and schools and vacation destinations, each vehicle representing individual freedom that Soviet citizens can barely imagine, but American workers create with their own skilled hands. The next morning brings questions that Petrov cannot ignore, doubts that creep into his mind like cold Michigan air through the gaps in his hotel room window. He sits at the small desk overlooking downtown Detroit, staring at 3 days' worth of notes that document productivity beyond Soviet imagination, yet something gnaws at his engineer's instinct for finding flaws in seemingly perfect systems. The numbers are undeniable. Ford's River Rouge plant produces more automobiles in a single day than his Moscow facility manufactures in a month, but the human cost of such relentless efficiency remains unclear. Victor sits across from him, equally troubled, translating American concepts that have no Russian equivalents while wondering what essential truths might be lost in the linguistic gaps between their worlds. The environmental reality becomes impossible to ignore during their final plant tour. Morrison leads them past waste treatment facilities that process 500 tons of industrial byproducts daily: steel shavings, chemical runoff, paint residue, and manufacturing debris that flows from the assembly line like a river of discarded abundance. The smell of industrial solvents mingles with the acrid smoke from furnaces that burn constantly, creating a haze that hangs over the Detroit River like a gray curtain between the plant and the sky. Petrov watches barges carrying coal and iron ore up the river while others haul away the accumulated waste of American prosperity, and he begins to understand that abundance comes with costs that Soviet planners never had to consider because they never achieved such massive production levels. The human pressure reveals itself in subtle ways that require careful observation to detect. During lunch break, Petrov notices how workers move with mechanical precision even when away from their stations, as if the assembly line rhythm has become embedded in their nervous systems. A union steward named Frank Kowalski, Bill's older brother, speaks quietly with Victor about growing concerns among workers who feel like extensions of the machinery they operate. The work pays well and provides security unknown in most of the world, but some employees struggle with the psychological weight of performing identical motions thousands of times each day for years that stretch into decades. The efficiency that produces such remarkable output demands human beings behave like precision instruments, sacrificing creative expression for economic prosperity. Morrison's honesty proves both refreshing and troubling when Petrov asks direct questions about the sustainability of continuous production. The plant manager admits that quarterly earnings drive every major decision, from worker scheduling to equipment maintenance to production targets that increase each year regardless of human limitations. Shareholders expect constant growth, dealers demand steady supplies of new vehicles, and competitors push each company to achieve higher output at lower costs. The system creates wealth and abundance, but it also generates relentless pressure that affects everyone from assembly line workers to corporate executives who must deliver ever-improving results or face replacement by more successful competitors. The darker realities emerge during a frank discussion with Ford executives who speak candidly about employment volatility that would terrify Soviet workers accustomed to guaranteed lifetime positions. American abundance comes paired with American uncertainty. Plants close when products become unprofitable. Workers lose jobs when companies relocate operations, and entire communities can collapse when industries move to more advantageous locations. The executives explain that 23 automotive facilities have shuttered permanently between 1955 and 1959, displacing thousands of families who depended on steady industrial employment. Job security, which Soviet ideology promises as a fundamental right, simply doesn't exist in American capitalism, where economic efficiency takes precedence over individual stability. The unemployment benefit system reveals both American generosity and American anxiety. Workers who lose their jobs receive government payments that help them survive while seeking new employment. But these benefits last only a limited time and cover only a fraction of previous wages. The social safety net catches falling workers, but it doesn't guarantee the comfortable landing that Soviet citizens expect from their government. Americans accept this uncertainty as the price of living in a system that creates unprecedented prosperity for those who can maintain their economic footing, but the psychological stress of potential job loss affects every worker who depends on wages rather than guaranteed state employment. In his hotel room that evening, Petrov writes carefully in his personal diary, documenting thoughts too complex for official reports. The pages fill with observations about contradictions that Soviet ideology never prepared him to analyze. American workers enjoy material prosperity that surpasses anything available to Soviet citizens, yet they live with economic insecurity that would cause riots in Moscow. The same system that produces abundance also produces waste on a scale that seems almost criminal to someone raised in a culture of scarcity. Individual freedom creates innovation and efficiency, but it also generates inequality and instability that centralized planning attempts to eliminate. The conversation with Bill Kowalski's teenage son reveals generational tensions that mirror broader American anxieties about the future. Young Americans grow up expecting prosperity as their birthright, yet they worry about inheriting environmental problems and social pressures that their parents' generation created through relentless industrial growth. The boy speaks casually about owning a car and attending college, opportunities that would represent impossible dreams for most Soviet youth, but he also expresses concerns about nuclear war and racial tensions that suggest American confidence masks deeper fears about social stability and global conflict. Standing at his hotel window, Petrov watches the River Rouge plant glowing in the distance like a mechanical constellation that never dims. The lights represent human achievement that commands respect and admiration, but they also symbolize questions without easy answers. Can any system sustain such intensive production indefinitely without exhausting natural resources or human endurance? Does the abundance justify the environmental costs and social pressures that make it possible? Are American workers truly free when economic necessity forces them to accept conditions that prioritize efficiency over human dignity? The questions multiply like assembly line products, each one raising additional complexities that challenge simple comparisons between competing economic systems. The final morning arrives gray and quiet, with autumn fog rolling off the Detroit River like a curtain, slowly lifting to reveal the last act of an impossible drama. Petrov packs his notebooks methodically, each page filled with sketches, calculations, and observations that will reshape Soviet automotive planning for the next decade. The leather briefcase that seemed adequate when he left Moscow now bulges with documentation of American industrial capacity that defies every assumption his engineering training taught him to accept. Victor sits on the hotel bed surrounded by translation notes, struggling to find Russian words for concepts that simply don't exist in Soviet vocabulary. Concepts like planned obsolescence, consumer choice, and the peculiar American faith that competition creates better products than central planning ever could. The weight of what they've witnessed settles on both men like the Michigan morning mist. 3 days ago, they arrived expecting to observe impressive but comprehensible industrial operations, perhaps gathering a few technical insights to improve Soviet production methods. Instead, they've encountered an economic system so fundamentally different from their own that comparison seems almost meaningless. Ford's River Rouge plant doesn't just outproduce Soviet facilities, it operates according to principles that Soviet planners consider either impossible or immoral, yet somehow creates prosperity that benefits ordinary workers more than most socialist policies achieve. During the final plant walkthrough, something unexpected happens that transforms Petrov's understanding from technical appreciation to human connection. Bill Kowalski approaches him during the coffee break, moving with the careful dignity of a man who has spent 20 years perfecting his craft on the assembly line. Through Victor's translation, Kowalski asks about Petrov's family, his work in Moscow, his impressions of American industrial methods. The conversation flows easily despite the language barrier, two engineers discussing the universal challenges of maintaining quality while meeting production targets, regardless of whether those targets come from Soviet planning committees or American corporate executives. Kowalski reaches into his work shirt pocket and produces a small Ford medallion, polished smooth by years of handling, explaining through gestures and Victor's careful translation that his father gave it to him when he started working at River Rouge 2 decades earlier. The medallion represents 3 generations of family employment, a tangible link between the worker who built bombers during World War II and the grandson who now studies engineering at Wayne State University. Kowalski presses the medallion into Petrov's palm, a gift that bridges the ideological gap between their nations through the simple recognition that skilled workers everywhere take pride in building things that improve people's lives. Petrov fumbles with his own coat pocket and retrieves a small Soviet engineering pin, enameled red with the hammer and sickle emblem, awarded to him for innovative improvements to Moscow plant operations. The pin means nothing to American capitalism, represents no monetary value in Detroit's economy, yet Kowalski accepts it with obvious pleasure, understanding that it symbolizes the same professional dedication that drives his own work. They shake hands firmly. Two men who build automobiles for governments that consider each other mortal enemies, yet who share the fundamental satisfaction of creating useful products with their own skilled labor. The final meeting with Ford executives reveals philosophical depths that surprise Petrov more than all the production statistics combined. When he asks not about manufacturing techniques but about the balance between efficiency and humanity, the response comes without political rhetoric or ideological defensiveness. The executives acknowledge that American industry still struggles with questions that have no perfect answers. How to maintain worker dignity while meeting competitive pressures. How to sustain environmental resources while pursuing economic growth. how to provide security for employees while preserving the flexibility that makes innovation possible. Their honesty impresses Petrov more than any propaganda about American superiority could accomplish. The flight back to Moscow provides hours for a reflection that will influence Soviet policy for years to come. Petrov reviews his notes while clouds pass beneath the aircraft, recognizing that his report must accomplish something more complex than simple technical recommendations. The American system works not because of superior ideology, but because of practical adaptations to specific circumstances, abundant natural resources, competitive markets, and cultural values that prioritize individual achievement over collective security. These conditions don't exist in the Soviet Union and can't be created through administrative decree, but certain American techniques can be adapted to serve Soviet goals without abandoning socialist principles. 6 months later, Petrov's Moscow plant begins implementing modified shift schedules that extend production hours while maintaining job security for all workers. The changes come gradually, respecting Soviet concerns about worker exploitation while incorporating American insights about continuous operations and efficient parts management. Production increases by 30% in the first year, not through revolutionary transformation, but through thoughtful adaptation of successful methods to different circumstances. The improvements benefit workers through higher wages and better working conditions while serving state goals of increased automotive output. The deeper lessons prove more valuable than specific technical improvements. Petrov's report influences Soviet planners to recognize that different economic systems can learn from each other without losing their essential character. American abundance stems from organizational efficiency and competitive motivation, not from superior ideology, which means Soviet industry can adopt successful techniques while maintaining socialist values of worker security and collective ownership. The exchange demonstrates that ideological opponents can engage in practical cooperation when both sides focus on shared goals of improving workers' lives and building better products. Years later, when Petrov becomes chief engineer for Soviet automotive development, he keeps Kowalski's Ford medallion on his desk as a reminder that skilled workers everywhere share common aspirations regardless of political systems. The medallion symbolizes the possibility of learning from ideological opponents without betraying fundamental values, of adapting successful methods while preserving essential principles, of building bridges between competing systems through mutual respect for professional competence and human dignity. Sometimes the most important discoveries aren't technical innovations, but human insights that transcend political boundaries and reveal shared hopes that unite rather than divide the workers of the world.